Bhavani, the former government spoke about a new constitution, and the new government also is promising one. Does Sri Lanka really need a new constitution?
Yes, I think we need a new constitution in terms of the fact that there's been so many amendments to what we have. So at the moment, the 1978 constitution has 20 amendments. The last amendment having brought about in last year. And it raises the question when you have 20 amendments that it has significantly changed form and character from what was proposed in 1978. And in the last few decades, we have also seen so much change in Sri Lanka in terms of the war, in terms of our own identity and the debates that surround us. So definitely we need a framework, a social contract that reflects the current needs, the current debates, but also in terms of what's happening internationally as well as nationally. So it has to be a more up-to-date framework that captures the needs, the grievances of its citizens. So we do need a constitution. A talk of a new constitution is not new. It's been there with every government, I would say, in the last few years. So not just the previous one. Also, governments have talked about looking at a new constitution, bringing a political solution. And the present government has set up a committee that is, I understand, looking at drafting something, um, uh, looking at proposals, and many of us have made to the committee. So that process seems to be ongoing, though very limited information as to what it is. The previous government went through quite an extensive process where they drafted several proposals. There was a lot of discussion in Parliament. But the weakness with a lot of these processes are that people, the citizenry, are not fully aware what this means. So I think when we talk about a new constitution, it also has to be something where there is much more public debate, public engagement, awareness, and also addressing some of the concerns, fears that people have. So, in the last few years in the constitution reform process, one of the things was there was a lot of misconception, misinformation, which created a lot of fear. Some said this is allowing to break the country, this is removing certain clauses, it's going to threaten certain communities. So, we, after decades of violence and divisions, Sri Lankans are in a very precarious place where there's a lot of suspicion, there's a lot of fear. So ideally, a constitution addresses these concerns, but that process also has to be one that is very inclusive, very participatory, and provides a lot of information. And that's lacking in a lot of these processes we've seen.
Right. And what about the legal reforms? What are the key legal reforms that Sri Lanka would need right now?
So I would say, I come as a lawyer and I say, yes, legal reforms are needed, but also structural reforms. So it's not just having a new law, but you also have a law that can be implemented. But also you have a culture, political culture, where people are aware of what the laws are, that they accept these laws, they're willing to abide by these laws. So you can't have a very technical process and say, we need these laws and that's going to solve all the problems. No, I think it's a much more holistic process. So in terms of the laws, I think there's a lot of laws that require changes, reforms. Let's just start with, for example, a couple of things like if you look at bribery, corruption, no? We have institutions in place like the Bribery Commission, but now there are lots of questions whether it's an independent process, whether people feel safe to come forward and give information, whether those are independent, there's protection. So I think we need, in terms of legal reforms, looking at establishing institutions that are independent, that is protected from political interference. We need laws that ensure people are able to come and give information, evidence, and are not attacked for giving this information. So witness victim protection laws, we do have witness victim protection laws. The problem is there are gaps in it. There's issues of protection. So we need reforms in that area. But we also need reforms in terms of, if you look at the violence, if you look at um, the levels of incitement, misinformation, disinformation. We need to look at the existing framework and identify what are the gaps, not just bring a law for the sake of bringing a law. So, for example, I would say, we're seeing a spate, and not just under this regime, but previous regime as well, attacks against minorities. Um, Ethno-religious violence. We saw the Aludgama incident, we saw Digana in 2018, we saw post-Easter Sunday, Muslims were attacked. Now, we do have laws to arrest, detain individuals who are part of these mob violence when there's evidence. It's not just targeting a person just for the sake of it, but when there's evidence, there's a legal framework under the penal code, under the ICCPR that can be used. A lot of the times it's not used, and people are not arrested even when there's evidence that's available. Or there is also the weaponizing of laws. For example, the PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, for example, being used to target minorities, critiques over the decades. So this is not just in this government. Over the decades, we've seen the weaponizing of laws that has been used to target particular groups of people, critiques of the government. So I would say there needs to be really a look at laws and identify what needs to be changed, but there could be laws that are fine but are not implemented. So there are two things that need to be done. But I think there are also laws such as the PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which really should be repealed. That's a extremely problematic law. That's not something you can keep reforming. It's a problematic law that was brought in as a temporary measure and now been here for a few decades. And we have individuals who have been in detention for decades because of laws like the PTA. And more recently, we have cases such as Hizbullah, Ahnaf, who've been targeted using the PTA. So there are some laws which are extremely problematic, which needs to go. But then there are the laws that could, I think, be reformed to be implemented better. And then there are laws that work fine, but they're just not implemented. So every case, I think every issue needs to be looked at. There needs to be a thorough study without just saying we need legal reforms. But then, as I said, there also needs to be the thought about, yes, you have good laws then, but then it needs to be implemented and you need to have the structures in place. You need to have individuals in place who will implement it without bias, without making it a political victimization. So I think there are different aspects when we talk about legal reforms.
Right. And moving on to people's accusation that politicians are very corrupt in Sri Lanka. But how are the politicians getting away with so much of corruption?
Mm. Again, there's, I think, a couple of aspects here. There is a culture. There is a culture that politicians, regardless of party, regardless of government, have been able to get away with a lot of issues of bribery, corruption, violence. So there is an impunity, culture of impunity, where politicians, those close to the respective governments that are in power, feel that's fine, they can get away with it. That comes with the fact that very limited cases have been investigated and prosecuted where there's been conviction, where there's been accountability for mismanagement, when there's evidence for mismanagement or bribery. And so there is this notion that a lot of people can get away with it. So again, when we look at these particular things, it goes back to we need strong, robust laws to look at particular instances of bribery, corruption. We need the expertise for individuals working in these state institutions to be able to investigate and prosecute. Because I think what we saw during the Yahapalane government was this promise that they will address allegations of bribery, corruption. That was one of the major campaign promises. But when they came to office, there was a complete collapse because they couldn't carry that through, and for different reasons. Maybe there was lack of evidence, maybe the legal framework wasn't up to date enough, maybe the institutions didn't have the capacity to address all those cases, all the dimensions involving the cases. So I think, one needs to really think about this as a bigger project, not just saying we have the perfect laws or the perfect structures, but a culture where there is this recognition it needs to be done, but also then practically that taking the steps in terms of capacity building, expertise, legal framework, ensuring people who come to give evidence are not targeted for giving evidence. So it's a combination. But it's also the public, all of us need to question and push for. We can't just at election time get excited and then take a step back. I think it's upon every citizen to keep questioning, to keep challenging, to protest, to file RTIs. I mean, that's one way many have really exposed levels of corruption and violence. So we need to also be aware of what we can do and not wait for the state entities to do it, in terms of really asking for political accountability. So political accountability can come in different ways, not just a prosecution, but just keeping the pressure, keeping attention on these issues.
Right. You also answered my fourth question slightly, Bhavani. Thank you so much for that. But let's look at that question also. Where can the public start to make a real change in this? Because whenever we go into an election, we go and we vote. There's a majority of people turning up to vote for politicians, and then there's a government that's elected. No, like several years afterwards, they want a change all the time. It's been the same with the former government, the government before that, and even now we can hear people talking about, okay, no, this is not what we expected the government to do. But how can people change this to make sure that there's a better government or better bodies to govern them?
I would say a couple of things, and I'm not saying this is kind of the laundry list, but I think a couple of things. One, the realization this is not going to happen overnight. I think there is, for many, this kind of is seen as a very short-term project. It's never short-term. These are larger political questions, and it takes decades for change. But we have to start somewhere. So we shouldn't wait for election times or when the campaigning happens. This is throughout. So as we speak, we need to be engaged. We need to be monitoring. We need to be keeping pressure on our elected representatives, not just in government, but also in opposition, So it's a combination. So for example, look at some of the big issues at the present moment. We have a pandemic. With the pandemic, we have seen increased militarization. We've seen a lot of regulations issued to restrict people's rights. We saw a protest last week where people were manhandled forcefully taken for quarantine. Now, there's a lot of debate around this. Now several cases have been challenged. There's a lot of criticism, and things like that is needed. We can't just say it's a pandemic and it's okay to do this. So citizens need to keep questioning the powers, both the elected representatives, but the state actors as well, as to does the police have this kind of power? Does the government overreach in certain things in the guise of national security or public health? So we need to continuously question. We can use existing tools, like I mentioned, the RTI. That's something that many have used, and it's one of the, I think, tools that has had the most impact in the last few years. So I think it's very important we look at things that are already there. Many now go to courts, they challenge filing FRs, writ applications. So there's more space for people to do it. There's more agency that many feel they can do it. So we need to constantly monitor, but also work with those who are already doing this work. There are the media that keeps highlighting these issues. There's lawyers continuously working on these things, trade unions. There's Sri Lanka in that sense still has a lot of diverse actors who are very active, very engaged, regardless of a pandemic. We've seen quite a bit of work. So for any citizen who's concerned, who's interested, I would say at least there are a lot of options. But the main thing is not to be complacent and not to think this is going to change overnight. It just, I would say, it just takes decades. And in a way, I've seen colleagues who've been doing this for decades and continuously do it. That energy, the resilience is remarkable. And for many of us, I think that's a learning thing, that, you can't just give up just because it takes a year or 2 years or 10 years. That's not the reason. So constantly being at it, but constantly questioning, just because official narrative says one thing doesn't mean we have to just take it as it is. We need to constantly question. Social media is a great avenue to get information now, just because earlier we would be reliant on just mainstream media, but social media, from Twitter to Facebook to WhatsApp, there's so many ways of getting information in the 3 languages. So, in a way, there's an abundance of information, but also knowing who to go to, because there's also a very sometimes irresponsible reporting as well, or fake news coming out. So I think we need to be very mindful. But I would say we're in a situation, despite the pandemic, there are so many things we can do. And remember, we are going into election cycles in 2023, 2024. National elections will happen around then. So what are we going to just sit back now and wait for those cycles, or are we going to get activated from now on? And when I say activated, this is not just putting pressure on the government, but also asking the opposition, what is their game plan? What are their policies? How are they putting pressure on the government? So, political accountability means we look at different actors, not just those in government, but a whole range of others.
All right. That's it. Thank you so much.